The interrogation room in the prisoner of war camp near Brussels was bare and cold. A single wooden table sat between two chairs, and the November rain of 1944 beat steadily against the blacked-out window. Across from the British intelligence officer sat General Major Kurt Meyer, formerly commanding officer of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, now a prisoner, taken during the fighting around the Scheldt. Meyer was 34 years old and already held the rank of Major General, a committed Nazi who had built his reputation on the Eastern Front and brought that same ruthlessness with him to Normandy. He had fought against American, British, and Canadian forces throughout the summer and fall of 1944. The intelligence officer was working through standard questions about German defensive positions when he decided to ask something more personal. Which Allied commander did Meyer consider the most dangerous? Meyer didn't hesitate. "The Canadian," he said, "Aldridge." The intelligence officer leaned forward, intrigued. "Not Patton, not Montgomery." Meyer shook his head. "Patton is fast but predictable. Montgomery is careful but slow. The American generals are brave but disorganized. But Aldridge, his face took on an expression the interrogator would later describe in his report as genuine professional respect, mixed with something approaching fear. Aldridge thinks like a German general. He understands combined arms at the operational level. He adapts faster than we can respond. And he does not care about casualties when he needs to break through. If all Allied commanders fought like Aldridge, this war would have ended months ago. The interrogation report worked its way through intelligence channels and eventually reached Canadian military headquarters, where it was filed alongside other captured documents. But Meyer's assessment was far from unique. In the months after the war ended, as Allied intelligence officers systematically debriefed captured German generals, a clear pattern emerged. When asked which Allied commanders had been particularly effective or dangerous, German officers consistently named Robert Aldridge. They spoke about him with a combination of professional admiration and genuine unease. They described him as the one Allied general who consistently surprised them, who forced them to react rather than execute their own plans, who seemed to anticipate their moves before they made them. To understand why German generals feared Aldridge more than commanders who were far more celebrated, you have to understand what made his approach to warfare fundamentally different from almost every other Allied general of the period. Robert Aldridge was 31 years old when he took command of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division in Sicily in 1943, making him one of the youngest divisional commanders in any Allied army. He was not a soldier in the traditional mold. He was a thinker, an intellectual who had studied military history and theory with the same intensity that others brought to medicine or law. Before the war, he had been an instructor at the Royal Military College in Kingston, where he had developed a reputation for brilliant analytical work combined with absolute intolerance for stupidity or incompetence. He had no patience for the gentlemanly traditions of the officer class, no interest in social hierarchy or political maneuvering. He cared about one thing: finding methods that worked and ruthlessly discarding everything that did not. What separated Aldridge from his contemporaries was his understanding of how modern warfare had actually evolved. Most Allied generals in 1944 were still fighting the First World War with Second World War weapons. They thought in terms of linear advances, of breaking through enemy lines with overwhelming artillery, of gaining ground through attrition. This approach worked when you had material superiority, which the Allies usually did. But it was slow, costly, and entirely predictable. German commanders had learned to defend against it through mobile reserves, strong points, and counterattacks that exploited the inevitable pause after initial Allied advances. The formula was well understood on both sides. The Allies would attack behind massive artillery preparation. The Germans would pull back from forward positions, ride out the bombardment, then hit back as Allied momentum stalled. Both sides had been running this script for years. Aldridge rejected it completely. He understood that the key to breaking German defenses was not more firepower, but better integration and timing, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support in ways that German defensive systems could not handle simultaneously. More importantly, he understood the psychological dimension of warfare at a level that seemed almost prescient. He knew that German commanders were trained to identify patterns, to read the rhythm of Allied attacks, and position their reserves accordingly. So, Aldridge deliberately designed operations that broke every pattern, that violated conventional military wisdom, that forced German commanders into situations they had not anticipated and did not know how to read. His first major innovation came during Operation Totalize in August 1944. The Canadian offensive designed to break through German lines south of Caen and open the road to Falaise. Previous attacks in this sector had followed predictable patterns. Heavy artillery bombardment at dawn, infantry advancing behind a creeping barrage, tanks moving up once infantry had secured their objectives. German defenders knew exactly what to expect and had constructed their defensive system specifically to counter these tactics. Aldridge studied the pattern and decided to do the opposite of almost everything conventional wisdom recommended. He would attack at night, not at dawn. He would use tanks to lead the assault rather than follow behind. He would convert self-propelled artillery into armored personnel carriers to keep infantry moving at the speed of tanks. And he would use heavy bombers to blast corridors through German defenses rather than relying on conventional artillery preparation. The plan was radical enough that senior British commanders tried to block it. Tanks could not fight effectively at night, they argued. Infantry could not maintain cohesion in darkness. The whole thing would dissolve into chaos before it covered any ground. But Aldridge had studied German defensive doctrine carefully, and he understood something his critics had missed. German anti-tank guns were positioned to cover approaches that would be used in daylight attacks. German artillery was pre-registered on traditional assembly areas. German reserves were positioned to respond to conventional assaults. A night attack, using unconventional methods, would bypass all of these prepared defenses before German commanders could reposition anything. The chaos of a night battle would favor the attacker who knew where he was going over a defender who had no idea where the attack was coming from. Aldridge got his permission to proceed. On the night of August 7, 1944, Operation Totalize began in a way no German commander had prepared for. 300 tanks and armored vehicles advanced through darkness, navigating by compass and following tracer fire from Bofor's guns that marked the axis of advance. Heavy bombers struck German positions just ahead of the advancing columns, destroying strongpoints and severing communications. Infantry rode in the converted self-propelled guns, protected from artillery, moving at the speed of armor rather than on foot. The German defensive system engineered to stop conventional daylight attacks, simply could not respond in time. By dawn, Canadian forces had penetrated 6 miles into German defenses, farther than any previous attack in that sector had managed. The German response revealed how completely Aldridge had disrupted their planning. Radio intercepts captured frantic exchanges between German commanders trying to make sense of what was happening. Where were the Canadians? How had they gotten so deep so quickly? Where should reserves go? The confusion was audible in the traffic. Kurt Meyer, commanding the defending sector, would later describe that night in his post-war interrogation as one of the most disorienting experiences of his entire military career. "We knew the Canadians were attacking," he said, "but we could not determine where or how until it was too late to stop them effectively. Every assumption we made about the attack proved wrong. Operation Totalize did not achieve all of its objectives. German forces eventually stabilized the situation through desperate counterattacks, and the operation stalled short of Falaise. But the method had proven itself. Aldridge had demonstrated that tactical innovation and operational surprise could achieve breakthrough even against determined German defenders with their backs to the wall. More importantly, he had shown that he was willing to take risks that other commanders avoided, that he would try radical approaches when conventional ones were not working. German commanders noticed. They began preparing specifically for unconventional attacks whenever Canadian forces under Aldridge were in their sector. They could no longer assume he would follow standard Allied procedures. This meant spreading defenses more broadly, concentrating forces less effectively, maintaining larger reserves to cover unexpected threats. Aldridge had imposed a psychological tax on German planning simply by demonstrating his willingness to innovate. But Aldridge was not just tactically innovative. He was operationally ruthless in ways that made German generals deeply uncomfortable, because they recognized it as their own doctrine. Most Allied commanders were cautious about casualties, particularly British and Canadian commanders whose nations had smaller manpower reserves and strong public sensitivity to losses. This caution produced methodical, deliberate operations that prioritized soldier safety over speed. Aldridge rejected this approach when the operational situation demanded it. He understood that in certain contexts, accepting heavy casualties to achieve rapid breakthrough would save lives overall by ending the campaign faster. He was willing to spend soldiers' lives when the strategic calculation supported it, and he made these decisions without the emotional paralysis that stopped other commanders in their tracks. This ruthlessness was on full display during the Scheldt campaign in October and November 1944. The Allies desperately needed to open the port of Antwerp to resolve their logistics crisis, but doing so required clearing German forces from the Scheldt estuary. A nightmare of flooded polders, fortified positions, and determined defenders. The operation promised to be slow, costly, and miserable by any measure. Most generals would have approached it with maximum caution. Aldridge approached it as a problem to be solved as quickly as possible, regardless of cost. He identified the key German positions, calculated what forces and firepower would be needed to overwhelm them, and then executed a series of concentrated assaults that crushed German defenses through sheer, focused violence. The casualty rates in the Scheldt were severe by Canadian standards. The 2nd and 3rd Canadian divisions suffered more than 6,000 casualties, in 5 weeks of fighting. But the operation achieved its objective in less than half the time British planners had estimated. The port of Antwerp opened in late November, ending the Allied logistics crisis and enabling the operations that would eventually close the war. Aldridge had made a cold calculation that rapid victory justified heavy losses, and events proved him right. But the willingness to make that calculation, to spend lives deliberately rather than accidentally, set him apart from almost every other Allied commander and made German generals recognize him as unusually dangerous. German commanders understood this kind of thinking because it reflected their own training and doctrine. Wehrmacht operational doctrine emphasized accepting casualties to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. German generals were trained to identify the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point where concentrated force could shatter enemy defenses, and to commit reserves without hesitation to exploit success. They expected this approach from other German commanders. They almost never encountered it among Allied generals who tended toward caution and deliberation. Aldridge was the exception. He thought in terms of operational art, of creating conditions for breakthrough and then exploiting them rapidly before the enemy could recover. This made him partially predictable to German commanders in one sense. They understood his operational logic. But it also made him extraordinarily dangerous because he had resources and firepower that German commanders in 1944 could only dream about. The combination of tactical innovation and operational ruthlessness created a commander who forced German generals to fight on terms they found deeply uncomfortable. They could not predict his methods because he kept changing them. They could not rely on his caution because he had none when the situation demanded action. They could not count on him making the kinds of errors that other Allied commanders made regularly, pausing to consolidate after initial success or refusing to exploit gaps because doing so violated the original plan. Aldridge was flexible enough to change plans mid-battle when he saw opportunities, aggressive enough to push beyond original objectives when success materialized, and ruthless enough to accept losses that would have caused other commanders to stop. Colonel Hans von Luck, a regimental commander in the 21st Panzer Division who fought against Canadian forces throughout the Normandy campaign, described Aldridge in his post-war memoirs as the one Allied commander they could not afford to make mistakes against. German forces could sometimes recover from errors against American or British commanders, von Luck wrote, because those commanders would pause or consolidate, giving us time to reestablish defensive positions. But Aldridge never gave us time. If we made an error, if we left a gap or positioned reserves poorly, he would exploit it immediately and without mercy. He fought at a tempo we could not match with the forces available to us. This operational tempo was another defining feature of Aldridge's command style. Most Allied operations followed a predictable rhythm: attack, consolidate, resupply, attack again. This rhythm allowed German defenders to recover between assaults, bring up reserves, repair their lines. Aldridge rejected this rhythm when circumstances allowed something different. During the advance through the Rhineland in February and March 1945, his forces maintained constant pressure on defending German units, attacking in rotation day and night, never allowing defenders to rest or reorganize. German commanders called this approach kalte Verfolgung, cold pursuit, and they hated it because it denied them the ability to implement their defensive doctrine effectively. The psychological impact on German soldiers facing Aldridge's formations was measurable. Soldiers who had fought against multiple Allied commanders reported that facing Canadians under Aldridge felt qualitatively different, more relentless, less predictable. A captured German officer from the 84th Infantry Division, interrogated after being taken prisoner during the Rhineland offensive, told his interviewers that fighting the Canadians was harder than fighting the Americans or British because you could never anticipate what they would do next. The Americans attacked the same way every time, he said. The British were very careful and slow, but the Canadians under General Aldridge, you could not predict them. They might attack at night. They might use new tactics. They might hit you where you thought you were safe. It was exhausting mentally, always waiting for something unexpected. That mental exhaustion was precisely what Aldridge was trying to create. He understood that morale and cohesion were as important as firepower in determining combat effectiveness. German forces in 1944 were generally well-trained and motivated, but they were also increasingly outnumbered and undersupplied. Kept off balance, denied rest, forced to react rather than execute their own plans, their effectiveness would degrade faster than any artillery could manage. Aldridge designed his operations to maximize this psychological pressure, to make German commanders feel they never had control of the situation. But Aldridge was not popular among his own troops. His ruthlessness and his willingness to accept casualties created resentment among soldiers who felt they were being spent recklessly. His cold personality and intolerance for failure made him a difficult commander to serve under. He did not inspire affection or loyalty the way some commanders managed. He inspired respect and fear in roughly equal measure. Soldiers who served under him knew he was brilliant and effective, but they also knew he would sacrifice them without hesitation if the operational situation demanded it. The contrast with other Canadian commanders was sharp. General James Carleton, commanding the 1st Canadian Army, was cautious and politically minded, acutely conscious of casualties and public opinion. Other divisional commanders were aggressive but conventional in method. Aldridge was neither cautious nor conventional. He was a cold calculator who designed operations based on mathematical assessment of force ratios, terrain advantages, and operational objectives. Human factors entered his calculations only as variables affecting combat power, not as moral considerations that might constrain operational choices. German generals recognized this coldness, and it frightened them. They were accustomed to fighting commanders who let emotion affect their decisions, who would halt operations after heavy casualties even when continuing would be operationally sound, who would avoid risks because of fear of failure. Aldridge never seemed to let emotion interfere with operational logic. If an attack needed to be made, he made it regardless of cost. If a position needed to be held, he held it regardless of casualties. If an opportunity emerged, he exploited it regardless of risk. This machine-like consistency meant German commanders could never count on human weakness, causing Aldridge to make poor decisions. He would do what the operational situation demanded. That made him extraordinarily difficult to fight. The Battle of the Hochwald Forest in February and March 1945 demonstrated all of Aldridge's characteristics operating simultaneously. The Hochwald was a dense forest covering the approaches to the Rhine, defended by crack German paratroopers who had built elaborate defensive positions. Conventional doctrine suggested bypassing such strong defenses or reducing them slowly through artillery and airstrikes. Aldridge decided to assault directly, calculating that rapid penetration would shatter German defensive plans and open the route to the Rhine before reserves could be positioned. The assault was brutal. Canadian infantry fought through the forest in close combat against dug-in defenders. Casualties were heavy, but within 72 hours, Canadian forces had broken through the Hochwald and were advancing toward the Rhine, forcing German commanders to abandon carefully prepared defensive plans and retreat hastily to avoid encirclement. General Lieutenant Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army defending that sector, reported to his superiors that the Canadian assault had been conducted with uncharacteristic speed and violence, overwhelming defensive positions before reserves could be effectively committed. Schlemm was a highly experienced officer who had fought on the Eastern Front and in Italy. He had seen aggressive attacks before. What struck him about Aldridge's assault through the Hochwald was the combination of careful preparation and ruthless execution. The Canadians had obviously studied our positions and identified our weaknesses, Schlemm wrote in his after-action report. They then attacked those weaknesses with concentrated force at a speed we could not match. General Aldridge clearly understands operational art at the highest level. This recognition from enemy commanders that Aldridge operated at an unusually high level of professional competence was the ultimate validation of his methods. German generals were trained in academies that elevated operational art, the level of warfare between tactics and strategy, to a near philosophical discipline. They studied historical campaigns with the intensity of scholars. They understood concepts like Schwerpunkt and Auftragstaktik that most Allied commanders barely knew existed. When German generals recognized that Aldridge understood and applied these same concepts, they recognized him as a peer. This was almost unique among Allied commanders. Patton was respected for boldness, but not for operational sophistication. Montgomery was respected for thoroughness, but not for flexibility. Eisenhower was respected as an organizer, but not as a field commander. Aldridge was respected as a complete operational commander who could plan brilliantly, adapt quickly, and execute without flinching. The fear German generals felt toward Aldridge was not fear of his personality or his reputation. It was fear of his competence, the way you fear a chess grandmaster when you are merely a skilled player. You know he sees the board more clearly than you do, that he anticipates moves before you make them, that he will exploit errors before you realize you have made them. This professional fear was in some ways more profound than the fear inspired by commanders who were simply aggressive or well-resourced. You could defend against aggression through caution and positioning. You could survive superior resources through mobile defense and tactical skill. But defending against superior operational thinking required matching that thinking, and most German commanders in 1944 did not have the resources or freedom of action to implement the kind of flexible mobile defense that might have countered Aldridge effectively. By the final months of the war, German intelligence had built a detailed profile of Aldridge and his methods. They knew that when facing Canadian forces under his command, they needed to expect unconventional attacks. rapid exploitation of any success, and relentless pressure that would not pause for consolidation. They repositioned reserves accordingly, maintained larger security forces, tried to build deeper defensive systems. But these adjustments required resources and manpower that Germany did not have in early 1945. Knowing exactly what Aldridge would do was not the same as being able to stop him from doing it. German commanders found themselves in the deeply frustrating position of understanding precisely how they were being defeated without possessing the means to prevent it. After the war, as military historians analyzed the campaigns in Northwest Europe, Aldridge's innovations gradually worked their way into Canadian and Allied doctrine. The night attack techniques pioneered in Operation Totalize became standard practice. The use of armored personnel carriers to keep infantry mobile alongside tanks became foundational to mechanized warfare. The emphasis on continuous operations to prevent enemy recovery became doctrine for exploitation phases. But during the war itself, these methods were uniquely associated with Aldridge, and German commanders who found Canadian forces under his command across the wire knew they were facing something out of the ordinary. The ultimate irony was that Aldridge remained almost completely unknown compared to commanders like Patton, Montgomery, or Bradley. He made no effort to cultivate a public image, gave no memorable speeches, built no relationships with war correspondents who might have broadcast his achievements. He was a professional soldier focused entirely on operational effectiveness, with no interest in fame or recognition. This meant that while German generals feared him and respected his competence, the wider public never learned who he was or what he had accomplished. His innovations were attributed to Montgomery, who commanded the army group Aldridge served under. His victories were celebrated as Canadian or Allied successes without specific attribution to his leadership. But within the smaller community of professional military officers who studied campaigns and analyzed battles, Aldridge's reputation grew steadily in the decades after the war. Military historians recognized his innovations. Staff colleges studied his operations as examples of operational art at its finest. German generals who wrote memoirs consistently identified him as one of the most capable Allied commanders they had encountered. The gap between his public obscurity and his professional reputation created a strange and persistent disconnect. A general the public had never heard of, regarded by military professionals as one of the finest operational minds the war produced. This disconnect reveals something important about the difference between military competence and military fame. Fame comes from victories, personality, dramatic moments that capture public imagination. Competence comes from the systematic application of sound principles, from innovation that works, from achieving objectives efficiently. The two do not always correlate. Patton was famous partly because of his personality and his flair for the dramatic, not only because of his effectiveness. Montgomery was famous partly because Britain desperately needed military heroes, and he was in the right place at the right time. Aldridge was obscure because he had no talent for self-promotion and no interest in anything beyond professional performance. But to the German generals who had to fight against him, his competence made him more dangerous than commanders who were far more famous. The question of why German generals feared Aldridge more than any other Allied commander comes down in the end to the nature of professional respect. German generals understood operational warfare at a level most Allied commanders never reached. They recognized with immediate clarity when they were facing someone who operated at that same level of understanding. Aldridge spoke their professional language, thought in their operational terms, and applied those concepts with resources they could not match. This made him uniquely dangerous in their assessment. He was not simply a brave general or a well-supplied general or a lucky general. He was a thinking general who understood the game they were playing and played it better than they could, given the forces available on both sides. The legacy of Aldridge's command style raises uncomfortable questions that have no easy resolution. His methods worked brilliantly in military terms. He achieved objectives, won battles, and advanced the Allied cause at critical moments. But his ruthlessness and his willingness to accept heavy casualties troubled those who served under him and continues to trouble the historians who study his campaigns. Can we admire his military genius while fully acknowledging the human cost of his methods? Should commanders be judged solely on effectiveness, or do moral considerations about how they treat the lives under their care also factor into the reckoning? These questions resist easy answers, but they cannot be set aside when examining his career. What cannot be disputed is that German generals recognized in Aldridge a commander who operated at the highest level of professional competence, who understood modern warfare in ways that most of his Allied contemporaries did not, and who applied that understanding with a ruthlessness that made him extraordinarily dangerous to fight against. Their fear of him was the fear of professionals recognizing a superior talent, of chess players recognizing a grandmaster, of soldiers knowing they are facing a commander who will make no mistakes they can exploit. That recognition, captured in interrogation reports and post-war memoirs, written by the men who fought against him and could not stop him, stands as the most authoritative judgment possible on Robert Aldridge's military ability. The enemy he defeated respected him more than almost any other Allied commander. That respect was built on fear, but it was fear rooted in genuine understanding of his exceptional competence. Aldridge may not have been famous, but to those who faced him across the wire, he was unforgettable.